My husband told me he couldn't have children. He said it with tears in his eyes, sitting across from me at our kitchen table 2 months after our wedding, holding my hands like I was something fragile. The doctors confirmed it, he said. Azispermia. No viable sperm. He showed me a lab report with his name at the top and a date from 18 months before we met. I held him while he cried. I told him it didn't matter, that we would figure it out, that there were other ways to build a family. I meant every word. That was 3 years ago. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist. I work at a children's rehabilitation center in Columbus, Ohio, helping kids rebuild motor skills after strokes, injuries, accidents. I've spent my entire career learning how to read people. How to tell when a child is pushing through real pain versus performing discomfort to avoid a hard exercise. You'd think that skill would have translated into my personal life. It didn't. Or maybe it did, and I just didn't want to see what I was reading. My name is Iris. I'm 31 years old. And last February, on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other Tuesday, I found out my husband had a son. The boy was 2 years old. His name was Mason, and he was a patient at my clinic. I didn't know any of this when I first pulled Mason's intake file. I was covering for a colleague who'd called in sick, so I had 3 new patients that day instead of my usual 2. Mason came in at 2:15 with his mother. She'd scheduled him for a sensory processing evaluation. He was having trouble with textures, sounds, crowded spaces, common presentation. I'd seen it dozens of times. His mother was young, maybe late 20s, with dark circles under her eyes that told me she hadn't slept well in a long time. She had the particular exhaustion of a single parent, the kind that sits behind the eyes and doesn't go away after a full night's rest. She filled out Mason's intake forms while I got down on the floor with him, letting him adjust to the new space on his own terms. He was a sweet kid, cautious, watchful, but once he decided I was safe, he handed me a plastic dinosaur from his backpack like it was a peace offering. I was reviewing the completed paperwork when I saw it. Under emergency contacts, she had written one name, not her parents, not a sibling, just one person. My husband's name. His cell phone number, the one I knew by heart because I'd dialed it 10,000 times, listed as father. I've tried to reconstruct what happened inside me in that moment, and the honest answer is that nothing happened. That's the strange thing about certain kinds of shock. You don't feel it. Your brain just goes very quiet and very efficient, like it switched into some emergency operating mode where emotion is a luxury you can't afford right now. I set the clipboard down on my knee. I looked at Mason, who was walking his dinosaur across the carpet. I looked at his mother, who was checking her phone. I said, "Everything looks good here. Let's get started." I got through the session. I don't know how. I made notes. I gave Mason sticker awards when he tried something hard. I talked to his mother about home strategies, about weighted blankets, about noise-cancelling headphones for grocery store trips. My voice was steady. My hands were steady. When they left, I walked to the single-stool bathroom at the end of the hall, locked the door, and sat on the floor with my back against the wall for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the clock on my phone. Then I stood up, washed my face, and went back to work. My husband's name is Donovan. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, dated for 14 months, and got married in a small outdoor ceremony in September 3 years ago. He's a structural engineer. He works long hours, travels occasionally for site inspections, and has always had a plausible explanation for every absence, every late night, every weekend morning where he slipped out before I woke up saying he needed to get to a job site before the crew arrived. He is the kind of man who makes you feel slightly embarrassed for doubting him. That's a skill I've come to understand, a very specific, very cultivated skill. I didn't confront him that night. I'd learned enough in my work with kids about the importance of having complete information before you act. A child who seems defiant is often a child who's frightened. A behavior that looks like one thing is often covering something else entirely. I needed to know what I was actually dealing with before I blew up my life over an emergency contact form. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe Donovan had a brother I didn't know about, or a cousin with the same name and number. I knew it wasn't a coincidence, but I needed to be certain. I started with what I had. I remembered the address on Mason's intake form because I'd read it twice, not on purpose, just the way your eyes move over a page when your brain is still catching up to what it's seeing. A street in Clintonville, about 4 miles from our house. I knew that neighborhood. We'd looked at houses there when we were first married, before we settled on our place in Bexley. The next morning, I told Donovan I had an early patient and left the house at 7. I drove to Clintonville. I found the street. I found a small brick rental house with a second-hand porch swing and a collection of sidewalk chalk drawings fading on the front walk. A sedan I didn't recognize was parked in the driveway. I sat in my car half a block away, engine off, and waited. At 7:45, Donovan's truck turned onto the street. He parked behind a sedan. He got out carrying a reusable grocery bag, the canvas ones we kept in a basket by our back door, and he walked to the front door of that brick house like he'd done it 1,000 times, because he probably had. He didn't knock. He used a key. The ordinary brutality of that detail. He had a key. I drove to work. I saw 6 patients. I ate a granola bar at my desk at noon and threw half of it away. On my lunch break, I called my older sister, who lives in Portland and who has always been better than me at being angry on my behalf, and I told her what I'd found. She said, very calmly, "Okay, before you do anything else, you need to protect yourself financially." My sister works in family law. She knows things. I spent the next 3 days doing what she told me. I made copies of our joint account statements, our mortgage documents, Donovan's pay stubs, our tax returns from the past 3 years. I opened a separate checking account at a different bank and moved 3 months of my salary into it. I wasn't stealing. Half of our joint savings was mine. I was just making sure I'd still be standing after whatever came next. On the 4th day, I went back to Mason's file. This was the part that required me to be careful. Patient records are protected. I'm not in the business of violating anyone's privacy. But Mason's mother had listed Donovan as an emergency contact, which gave the clinic a legitimate reason to have his information on file. What I was looking for wasn't in the medical records. It was in the intake paperwork, the basic demographic form that every family fills out in the waiting room. Under "How did you hear about us?" she'd written, referred by pediatrician Dr. Okafor. We had the same pediatrician group, or rather, my nephew did, my brother's kid. Dr. Okafor's practice was about 3 minutes from Mason's house in Clintonville. None of this was evidence of anything, technically, but it was the texture of a life, a parallel life built from the same ordinary materials as mine, running alongside mine for how long? Mason was 2, which meant this had started at least 3 years ago, before we got married, possibly before we even met. I needed to talk to her, Mason's mother, not as Iris, my husband's wife, as someone who could actually help her. I thought about it for 2 days before I decided how to do it honestly. I couldn't go to her door pretending to be someone I wasn't. That wasn't who I was, and if this woman had been lied to the way I suspected, she deserved better than more deception. So I called the clinic's front desk from my personal cell phone, explained that I was Mason's therapist and that I'd realized after the session that I had a potential conflict of interest I needed to disclose to the family before we proceeded with treatment. It was true. Every word of it was true. The coordinator said she passed my number along. She called me back that same evening. Her name was Josephine. Her voice was tired and a little guarded, the way people sound when they've learned that phone calls from professionals usually mean more problems. I told her I needed to meet with her in person. I told her it was important, and that it wasn't about Mason's treatment being in question. I told her to bring whatever documentation she had about Mason's father, because I thought she and I had more in common than she might expect. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He told me he was divorced." We met at a coffee shop on North High Street on a Saturday morning. Donovan thought I was visiting a friend. Josephine arrived 5 minutes early. She was already at a corner table when I walked in, her hands wrapped around a mug, her expression composed in the careful way of someone who has been preparing themselves for a hard conversation. Mason was with her mother for the morning. I sat down across from her. I put my phone on the table, opened to a photo of Donovan and me at my cousin's wedding last summer. He was in his good charcoal suit, his arm around me, both of us laughing at something someone had said just off camera. "Do you recognize this man?" I asked. She looked at the photo for a long time, her jaw tightened. "That's him," she said. "That's Ryan." Ryan, not Donovan, a different name, a different identity. He'd told her his name was Ryan, that he was a divorced structural engineer whose ex-wife had been unstable, controlling, that the divorce had been ugly and she still sometimes contacted him, and that was why he had to keep certain things private. He'd told her he was working toward moving in with her, that Mason deserved to grow up with his father present. He'd said all of this, I later learned, at different intervals over the span of 2.5 years, in careful, measured doses, always just enough to keep her holding on. I set our marriage certificate on the table beside the phone. Ohio State seal, both our names, the date. I watched her read it. She didn't cry right away. She read it twice, carefully, the way you read something when you're hoping you misunderstood it the first time. Then she set it down flat on the table and pressed both palms against it and looked out the window at the Saturday morning traffic on High Street. "I have a son," she said. "Not to me, just to the heir." "I know," I said, "and I'm so sorry. You deserve to know the truth." She asked me how I'd found out. I told her everything, Mason's intake form, the emergency contact, the morning I'd sat in my car and watched Donovan walk into her house with a key. Her expression, when I described that detail, the key, shifted into something colder and more resolved, like a door closing inside her. We sat there for almost 2 hours. I bought us both more coffee. We talked the way women talk when they've been placed, without their consent, into a situation that requires them to decide very quickly whether they're going to be enemies or allies. It wasn't a difficult decision. We'd both been handed the same lie by the same person. What was there to fight about? She told me about the night Mason was born. Donovan, Ryan, had been in the delivery room. He'd held Mason first, she said. He'd cried, real tears, she was almost certain. And then he'd gotten a text, said something about a work emergency, and been gone within the hour. She'd spent the first night after her son was born alone in a hospital room. I thought about where I'd been that night. The timeline placed Mason's birth around 16 months into our marriage. I tried to remember. Something about that month felt thick and wrong when I reached for it. And then I did remember. Donovan had gone to Cincinnati for what he said was a week-long project review. I'd called him every night. He'd answered every time. I excused myself and went to the bathroom and gripped the edge of the sink and breathed. When I came back to the table, Josephine was looking at her phone. She looked up. "He just texted me," she said. "He wants to know if he can come by tonight. See Mason." She turned the phone so I could read it. The same number. The same casual, affectionate tone he used with me. I looked at her. "What do you want to do?" She thought for a moment. "I want him to come." We made a plan, the two of us, over the last of our coffee. It was not a complicated plan. It didn't need to be. The truth rarely requires elaborate staging. I went home. Donovan was watching college football. He asked how my friend was doing. I said she was going through a hard time, but she'd be okay. He nodded, already looking back at the screen. I went into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, feeling the specific loneliness of being in a room with someone who doesn't actually know you exist. I thought about the infertility story, the lab report with its official letterhead, the date, his name at the top. I thought about how efficiently that story had closed off all my questions, all my instincts. Any time I'd mentioned wanting children, he'd steered the conversation into his grief, in a way that made me feel guilty for even bringing it up. I'd spent 3 years accommodating a loss that wasn't real. 3 years of modified dreams. 3 years of becoming smaller so that his fictional pain could take up more space. That night, I drove to Clintonville. Josephine let me in without a word. Her apartment was small and warm and smelled like the cinnamon candle she had burning on the kitchen counter. Mason's drawings were taped to the refrigerator, a row of small sneakers by the door. She'd made tea. We sat at her kitchen table and waited. He knocked at 9:17. I know the exact time because I was watching the microwave clock. She opened the door. He came in smiling, holding a paper bag from Mason's favorite pizza place. She'd mentioned once that he always brought pizza on Friday nights, and old habits apparently don't die easily. He was talking before he'd fully crossed the threshold, something about traffic on 315, and then he turned and he saw me standing at the end of the hallway. The paper bag dropped about 2 inches before he caught it. His face went through several things in quick succession. I recognized all of them. Iris, my name in his mouth, in that house, sounded like a word from a foreign language. "Hey, sweetheart," I said. The word tasted like copper. He looked at Josephine, then back at me. The smile had been replaced by something I hadn't seen on him before. Pure, unguarded calculation, looking for an exit. "I can explain," he started. "Ryan," Josephine said, just that. His fake name, spoken quietly, like she was setting something heavy down on a table. He flinched. "Joe, listen." "Mason's asleep," she said. "You're not waking him, not tonight." I stepped forward and put our marriage certificate on the kitchen counter beside the pizza bag. "I filed for divorce this morning," I said. "You'll be served on Monday. My attorney's name is on the paperwork. She's also already spoken to the county about the fraudulent joint loan you took out in March, using my signature, the one I didn't sign." Donovan's face went still. Whatever script he'd been running in his head, I'd just cut to a page he hadn't prepared for. "The loan," he said. $42,000 against our home equity. I found it when I was pulling our financial records. My voice was even. I'd practiced this part. "You forged my signature. That's bank fraud on top of everything else. My attorney thinks the district attorney's office will find it very interesting." He sat down heavily on Josephine's couch like someone had cut his strings. He put his face in his hands. I watched him do it and felt almost nothing. Or rather, I felt something underneath the nothing. Something that would take months to fully surface. But in that kitchen I just felt clear. Simplified. "How did you—" he began. "How did I find out?" I said. "You listed yourself as Mason's father on a form at my clinic. Your real name, your real phone number, the same one you've had since before we met." The quiet that followed had a particular quality. The refrigerator hummed. The candle flickered. From down the hall came the faint sound of a 2-year-old shifting in his sleep. Josephine stood by the window with her arms crossed, looking at the man she'd loved for 3 years, the father of her child, the person who'd given her a fake name and a rehearsed tragedy, and a key that turned a deadbolt she'd never questioned. Her expression wasn't angry. It was finished. "There's a difference. You need to leave," she said. "Right now. And you don't come back to this house until there is a legal custody agreement in place that I have reviewed with my own attorney. You don't call me. You don't text me. You go through lawyers from here on." Donovan stood. He picked up the pizza bag. He put it back down because there was nowhere to take it. He looked at me one more time, and I think he was hoping for something, some crack in my expression, some small opening for negotiation. There wasn't one. He left. The door clicked shut behind him with a mildness that seemed absurd given the circumstances. Josephine and I stood in her kitchen. Outside, we heard his truck start and pull away. "He took the pizza," she said. I looked at the counter. He had. "Of course he did," I said. And then, improbably, we both laughed. It was the helpless, disbelieving kind of laughter, the kind that comes from exhaustion and absurdity and the sheer relief of a thing finally being over. We laughed until Josephine pressed a hand over her mouth so she wouldn't wake Mason, and then we laughed a little more, quietly. The weeks that followed were complicated in the practical ways and simpler in the emotional ones than I'd expected. Donovan didn't fight the divorce, possibly because his attorney advised him that fighting a spouse who had documentation of forged financial instruments was not a strategically sound position. He vacated our house within 30 days. I bought out his share of the equity, using funds secured partly from the fraudulent loan that was now in dispute, which my attorney dealt with in ways that I mostly didn't follow but was grateful for. The fraud investigation moved slowly, as these things do, but it moved. His employer was notified of the legal proceedings, which had professional consequences I won't pretend not to be glad about. Josephine found her own attorney, a sharp woman out of Worthington who specialized in cases involving paternity and coercive control. The custody arrangement took 4 months to negotiate. Donovan was granted supervised visitation, which required him to make every excuse in the world to reschedule and often didn't show. Mason adjusted, as small children do, with a resilience that broke my heart a little and healed it at the same time. I kept him as my patient through it all. We disclosed the personal connection to the clinic's ethics board, explained the situation, and they agreed that continuity of care outweighed the conflict given that the conflict was no longer active. Mason made real progress. By summer, he could handle the grocery store without headphones if the trip was short. He still gave me the first dinosaur out of his backpack at every session. Josephine and I became something that doesn't have a clean name, not quite friends, not quite family, but something sturdy. We texted, we met for coffee on occasional Saturdays. When her car needed a repair she couldn't afford, and she was too proud to ask for help, I just paid it without making it a discussion, and she accepted that without making it a debt. These were the kinds of negotiations you learn when you've been through something together that rearranges your understanding of who belongs in your life. In October, my clinic hired a new physical therapist. His name was Scott. He was 37, quiet in the particular way of people who are paying attention, and he'd moved to Columbus from Denver after his wife passed away from an illness 2 years earlier. He had a daughter in 2nd grade named June who he brought to the clinic's fall family event because he didn't yet know many people in the city. June found Mason's dinosaur on the waiting room floor, and instead of taking it, she brought it to the front desk and asked who it belonged to. I happened to be watching when Scott crouched down beside her and told her she'd done the right thing. I didn't speak to him that day beyond the normal, professional hello. But I thought about that moment later, at home, in my newly quiet house that I was slowly learning to inhabit as mine and not ours. I thought about how you come to understand the difference between a person who performs goodness and a person who is actually practicing it when they think nobody's looking. I didn't rush anything. I wasn't ready to, and I didn't want to be. Some things need their full season, but I started to notice the small things. The way Scott left the break room cleaner than he found it, the way he actually listened when the front desk staff talked to him, the way he told a 7-year-old patient that his hard work mattered. On a Thursday afternoon when there was no audience and no reason to perform, the way patients practice consistently and without fanfare is one of the rarest things there is. He asked me to lunch in November. I said yes. The night before that lunch, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the version of myself who had sat across from a lab report 3 years ago and chosen to believe it because the alternative was too disorienting to hold. I didn't blame her. She had been doing the thing that people in love do, which is to offer trust as a gift and hope it isn't wasted. It was wasted. That's not a reflection of her judgment. That's a reflection of who she trusted it to. I thought about Josephine, who'd done the same thing with a man who gave her a false name and who was somehow raising their son with more grace and steadiness than the boy's father had ever shown for anything. I thought about Mason, who had no idea about any of it, who just knew that there was a lady at the clinic who had stickers and let him bring his dinosaur and never asked him to do more than he was ready for on any given day. I thought about how I'd spent 3 years believing I was grieving the possibility of biological children, and how that grief had been manufactured. And how, somewhere in the middle of all the wreckage, I'd found out that I already knew how to mother, that I'd been doing it for years, at work, on the floor with the dinosaur, At 2:15 on a Tuesday, when a small boy decided I was safe enough to hand over his most important possession. Pain has a way of demanding your entire attention. It convinces you that it's the main thing, the defining thing, the shape that everything else has to fit around. It's not. I know that now. Pain is just one season in a place that has all four. The lunch was good. We talked for 2 hours and then walked around Schiller Park because neither of us wanted to stop talking. June, he told me, had recently decided that her life's goal was to train dogs to help people who were scared of thunderstorms. He wasn't sure how that would work, practically, but he told it sounded like important work and they were going to figure it out together. I thought, walking beside him through the October leaves, that this was what it looked like when someone told the truth without needing anything in return for it. I have learned this past year that starting over doesn't feel the way movies suggest it will. It doesn't feel like standing at the edge of something new. Wind in your hair, horizon stretching out. It feels, mostly, like waking up on an ordinary morning in a house that is yours again and making coffee and letting the day be quiet before it has to be anything else. It feels like receiving a text from Josephine at Mason said a full 4-word sentence at breakfast and knowing that the work is paying off. It feels like June running into the waiting room and asking if I've seen her dad because she has something important to tell him and it cannot wait. There is no version of what Donovan did that was acceptable or forgivable. There is no framing that softens the 3 years of orchestrated deceit, the forged documents, the strategic grief, the name given to another woman like an identity discarded and replaced. Those things happened. I carry them, but they are not the whole of the story, and they are not the ending. My name is Iris. I am 32 years old. I am a pediatric occupational therapist in Columbus, Ohio. I have a standing Saturday coffee with a woman who, under different circumstances, might have been my enemy and is instead one of the people I trust most in the world. I have a small boy who brings me a dinosaur every Tuesday and a colleague who tells his daughter that good work matters even when nobody's watching. The math of a life, it turns out, is more forgiving than I expected. Add up the broken things and the equation doesn't always resolve to loss. Sometimes what's left over, after everything that was taken, is exactly enough to build something real. I think about the version of myself who sat across from that lab report 3 years ago and chose to believe it, not because I was foolish, because I was decent. There's a difference that took me a long time to understand. Donovan didn't succeed for 3 years because I was naive. He succeeded because I had integrity, and he knew how to borrow against it. Every time I almost asked a harder question, he answered with grief, and I backed off because I respected his pain. That's not a flaw in my character. That's my character being used against me. The lesson I've had to sit with is that being a good person doesn't protect you from people who aren't. What it does, eventually, is leave you with something to rebuild from. Donovan had nothing to rebuild from when it all came apart. I had everything. What I did in those 4 days after I found Mason's intake form, the financial documents, the separate account, the quiet and methodical gathering of facts, before I made a single accusation, that wasn't coldness. That was the kind of clear thinking that only happens when you stop letting fear make your decisions. I'd spent 3 years being managed by Donovan's emotions, real or manufactured. Those 4 days were the first time in our marriage that I was thinking for myself, completely, and every choice I made in that window protected me in ways I'm still grateful for now. Josephine did the same thing, in her own way. When she sat across from me at that coffee shop and read our marriage certificate, she could have collapsed. She could have called Donovan Ryan and screamed. She didn't. She asked careful questions. She thought about Mason first. She contacted an attorney before she contacted her feelings. That kind of steadiness in the middle of the worst news of your life is not something you're born with. It's built. Josephine built it by surviving 3 years of raising a child mostly alone, by paying rent without help when the help didn't show, by learning the hard way that she was more capable than the person she loved had ever allowed her to believe. What undid Donovan wasn't cleverness on our part, though I'm proud of what we figured out. What undid him was the accumulation of his own choices. Every forged signature, every fake name, every manufactured story. Each one added a stone to a wall that was always going to fall. The weight of a lie isn't distributed evenly over time. It sits, and it compounds, and eventually the structure can't hold. He built the trap himself. We just stopped holding the door open. I'm not interested in pretending this story made me stronger in some clean narrative way. The truth is messier. There are still mornings when I wake up and feel the specific shame of having been deceived for that long, of having comforted a man through grief he invented. That feeling doesn't have an expiration date. What I've learned to do is hold it alongside everything else. Alongside Mason handing me a dinosaur, alongside Josephine texting me a voice memo of his first full sentence, alongside Scott telling his daughter that doing the right thing matters even when no one's watching. The math of a life is not always fair, but it is, in my experience, honest. What you practice becomes what you are. Donovan practiced deception until it was the only thing he knew how to do. I practiced showing up, paying attention, and telling the truth even when it cost me something. In the end, we each got the life those habits built. I'd rather have mine.